Welcome back to Americana on Tour. I'm Dan Barth, and this week we meet famous mountain men and learn how the Rocky Mountain fur trade influenced exploration of the West. Most of the early explorers of the Old West were hunters and trappers. Many times the fur companies looking for more beaver would have their trapper scouts like John Colder map an uncharted wilderness area like the Yellowstone Valley. Come with us now as Bob Edgar at Trailtown gives us a closer look at famed mountain men and trappers Jeremiah Johnson and Jim Bridger. If we had to choose one man to represent the mountain men of America, Jim Bridger would be that man. And our friend Bob Edgar is going to talk about some personal exploits that Jim Bridger had right here in the Bighorn Basin.
Well, I think you're right about that statement, Dan. Jim Bridger has to be the #1 mountain man of the West. Many others did great feats, but Bridger started in the West at the age of 16 on one of the early fur trade expeditions. On that first expedition, Hugh Glass, one of the party, was chewed up by a grizzly bear and on the verge of death. And Bridger and Fitzgerald, another member, were left behind by the party to watch Glass until he died. But as they were there with him, they felt he was going to die. It looked hopeless. All around them were hostile Indians on the ridges. They were scared they'd be killed if they stayed. So they finally decided they'd just say they left him and that he did die. They took his rifle and some possessions and went back to the main party and said that Glass had died. It turned out Hugh Glass didn't die, and he managed to crawl many miles to get back to where the party was, and swore revenge on both of them, but he let Bridger go because he was just a boy. But Bridger went on from there and got involved with his own fur company. He'd been all over these mountains, one of the first explorers in the Yellowstone Park region. He built Fort Bridger, he guided military wagon trains, did about everything the frontier had to offer through his life. And when he was older, approaching 60, he established the Jim Bridger Trail across the Bighorn Basin. And prior to that, a government expedition had tried to map a wagon route across the Bighorn Basin, and they had trouble. They lost their wagons in the Shoshone River right behind us here in 1859, and they turned in a report that the Bighorn Basin was impassable for wagon. In 1863, gold was discovered at Alder Gulch, and Virginia City, Montana developed right after that. And then the gold rush was on to Montana, and John Bozeman set up a trail on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains right through the Sioux and Cheyenne Indian hunting country. And from the very start, they were in battles with the Indians. It was a dangerous trail, and so Jim Bridger decided to establish a trail through the Bighorn Basin on the west side of the Bighorn Mountains to avoid the danger of the Indian country. So in the spring of 1864, he left the Platte River with 60 wagons and 300 people and started to establish a trail and building the trail as they went right across what was thought to be impassable country. And he actually got through to Virginia City by July 10th, building trail, building ferry boats out of cottonwood logs to get wagons across the Bighorn Yellowstone River. Got the miners up there and made one return trip back to Fort Laramie, got another party in the late summer, and started again for Virginia City. They got as far as Bozeman, Montana, where Bozeman is now, on December 18th, where they got snowed in by deep snow. But the miners went on with their saddle horses and got into Virginia City that winter. But here was Bridger, almost 60 years old, made these two trips, probably close to 2,000 miles of wagon trail, building trail, and getting these people through. That's quite a remarkable feat. And the Bridger Trail was definitely the safest trail. Many travelers used it after that. The biggest drawback was the grass was not as good on this side of the mountain, and many travelers still used the Bozeman Trail until it was finally closed in 1868, and the Indians burned the forts along the trail at that time. But Bridger did many things, and this was his country, and he when you add it all up, you just have to give him credit for being the #1 mountain man of the West.
In retracing the steps of Jim Bridger, we found ourselves at Fort Bridger, Wyoming, and stumbled onto two of the most knowledgeable historians, reenactors, and modern-day mountain people that I've ever seen. And we're here today with Dick and Sandy Gregory. We're pleased to have you on our show.
Well, thank you.
Sandy, can you tell us a little about Jim Bridger?
Yeah, Jim Bridger was a trapper. He came to the West with the Ashley and Henry expedition and trapped for 20 years. At the close of the fur trade, he needed a new occupation, and so he established Fort Bridger in 1843 on the Black's Fork, and he traded with the immigrants, resupplied their whatever they needed, coffee, sugar, flour. He did blacksmithing work and carpenter work, repairing wagons. He traded tired animals for fresh animals. He also traded with the Indians. There were Shoshones and Utes that would come here and trade at Fort Bridger. They were trapping expeditions that left out of Fort Bridger, and they were still doing a little bit. The fur trade was really at an end. There were trappers and their Indians' wives that lived here at the post.
Bridger had itchy feet. He wanted to get out there. He wanted to see what was on this side of the hill, what was on the other side of the hill. Any place to explore, he wanted to know where it was and what was on the other side. But as far as business going on here at the stockade on a day-to-day basis was very, very busy from what we can figure. Because, what do you say, the wagon repairs and etc. was very important here at that time, plus supplying their needs that they needed to go on.
What we have here is the pre-military time period here before 1849, anytime during the 1840s around Fort John. The mountain men who used to trap beaver in the 1820s and 30s had pretty much gotten out of the business, and what they were into now by the late 1830s and 40s was trading buffalo hides with the Indians for the kinds of items that you see here. So during the summer it was very common to see the trappers come down to a place like Fort Union or Ben's Fort or Fort John here and set up a little summer camp with their Indian wife. They'd set up their lodge and they would just trade with the Indians for the buffalo hides, since the whites didn't want to go out and hunt the hides themselves. So what they would bring out would be chunks of lead, and the Indians could then make their own bullets. They would have an iron pot like this, and they'd put it over the fire. After a few minutes they would melt the lead. They'd have a ladle or a spoon, and they'd pour it in this opening right here, and after a few seconds they'd have a lead bullet for your rifle. It was a lot cheaper than buying bullets already made, just to go ahead and make up your own. Skinning knives. The Indians thought these were very, very useful, and they were, because in the early days the Indians would have to use sharp stones or flints to scrape animal hides. A little bit later on the whites came out and they brought out steel blades. Now the Indians can get the elk antler any place. They would secure that steel blade in there, and then they would have a scraping or a fleshing tool for their hides. Better than that, of course, would be your curved blade skinning knives made by Russell Company, known as the Green River knife, which was really about as good as you could get. So the Indians were more than happy to trade for these items. The trappers would bring out axe heads like this from St. Louis. Now the Indians would make their own handle, but they can't make the axe head, so the trappers would not bring this out, but they would bring out the axe head. And the Indians could then sometimes use that, make it into a pipe, ceremonial pipe, a calumet. Here's your pipe bowl, smoke it out of here. So what you do is you bring out the tobacco, which the whites had plenty of, and they would give this to the Indians, and you would smoke the pipe, pass around the jug, have a little whiskey, exchange presents, and then you get down to the real business of trading. They would bring out steel, strikers. Now the Indians could get the flints out of any mountain stream, but they can't get this. Now what this is used for is creating sparks, and what you would do is try to get some of those sparks to land on some charred cloth or possibly some dry tinder. Or if you didn't want to do it like that, you had your brass tinder box with a magnifying lens. You could catch the rays of the sun on this and get it to start in no time. Or if you were having a bad day, you could use your matches, but generally you want to save those. Mirrors, Indians love to have the mirrors. Pipe bowls. This came from Pipestone Quarry in Minnesota. Clay pipes came from England. Glass beads. The Indians were into beadwork before the whites came out here, but they didn't use these, they used seeds. But these were already colored, already had holes in them, so they liked those. And they would sometimes make chokers, which would go around your neck like this. They used pipe bone from fishes or small animals or birds, and then used those with brass or glass beads. They also had ribbon and lace, fabric, tobacco, whiskey, and the British blankets. And the Indians wanted the British blankets more than the American ones. They tended to last a little bit longer, and they could tell which the British blankets were because they had these marks or points. And these points let the Indians know what quality blanket these were and gave them a rough idea of what they could trade for. The general method of trade was to exchange one buffalo hide for one item, except when it came to firearms. So you would generally exchange one buffalo hide for one skinning knife, one buffalo hide for one axe head, one, possibly two buffalo hides for a good Hudson Bay blanket. When it came to firearms, like a good Hawken rifle like this, you could command anywhere from 15 to 20 buffalo hides for something like this, which would be an enormous investment for the Indians. However, once they got this, they would be in business, and now they were able to go out and hunt in excess of buffalo, whereas with bows and arrows, it would be most difficult for them to do that. They would bring their Indian wives down, set up a lodge like this. We have a canvas lodge as opposed to buffalo hide, but by the 1830s and 40s, canvas was available. And if you were an Indian woman, you found this to be much better because this was much easier to sew than buffalo hides, and much easier to put up and take down and transport. And it also freed hides that you would use for your lodge to exchange for items like this. So for the Indians' point of view, it made an enormous amount of sense to do that. And by the 1870s, most of them had no choice but to use canvas because the buffalo were pretty well being trapped out and shot, and there weren't many left.
Dan, right now we're in Jim White's cabin, the famous buffalo hunter. This is typical of the cabins of the frontier, trappers, hunters, people of that type. They're small, they're easier to heat, they're temporary shelters, something they could build fairly fast. This particular cabin was built at their hunting camp on the mouth of Shell Creek on the Bighorn Mountains. They built it in the fall of 1880. And Jim White was murdered at this site that fall. But there's a lot more story about him. But anyway, this was a typical cabin of that period, and this was an original buffalo hunter's cabin.
Earlier we discussed the amounts of buffalo that were killed by one party, and I think you have the figures on Jim White's party.
Well, that's right. There's an account that his hunting partner, Oliver Hanna, wrote down about their hunting experiences on the Yellowstone River in the winter of 1879 and 80. And that winter they killed 4,600 buffalo north of the Yellowstone. And they had bull teams, freighters, come out in the spring to freight those hides back into the Yellowstone River at Miles City. And there, along with other hunters, the steamboats that come up the river in the spring would bring supplies up, and then they'd haul the buffalo hides back down the river. They said those steamboats, when they went back down, were so heavy with buffalo hides you could hardly see the smokestacks, and they could barely float going back down the river. Just hundreds of thousands of buffalo robes were being shipped then.
Well, Bob, I found a written account that has been published before 1900 by Dudley Nathan Hale, and these are his words describing the hunt that they had in 1881. As the country at that time fairly alive with wolves, deer, elk, buffalo, and antelope, we put in a very good winter. They returned to Denver in the spring and later pulled out for the Yellowstone again, arriving there in early November 1881. We found the buffalo there in countless thousands. We remained here 2 winters disposing of the products of the chase at the different little towns that had sprung up along the route of the Northern Pacific Railroad. One bright morning in 1883, while hunting for the buffalo herds, we suddenly realized that the American bison or buffalo was extinct.
Well, that account matches up with other hunters' accounts. They started coming back from the hunting grounds and saying the buffalo were not on the Yellowstone River, and they're over on the Absaroka Mountains. Hunters from the Absaroka Mountains would say they're on the Yellowstone River. Hunters from some other area would say they were somewhere else. It turned out they were just gone. They couldn't believe it. They were just dumbfounded that the buffalo could be killed off. There were a few stragglers left along the mountains. The last, in some accounts at Fort Washakie, they say they were completely out of Indian tanned buffalo robes in 1885. And Vic Arland, who had a little trading post on Meteetsee Creek, said 1885 was the very end of their robes that they got from the Indians. And the Indians were in the hide hunting business also for many years. The incentive for them was the trade goods that the white man brought out: guns, ammunition, cloth beads, tobacco, alcohol, all these things that they wanted to trade for. So they were out killing buffalo for the robes, but the Indian market was for tanned robes. And one fur company man in 1868 wrote an article where he said, if the Indians continue to hunt the buffalo at the present rate, they'll be extinct within 14 years. He said they were then trading with about 70,000 Indians on the upper Missouri and other tributaries. He said the Indians would transport the tanned robes for as far as 300 miles by travelway to the trading houses on the rivers, and that they were actively in that market. Of course, the incentive was presented by the white man for the trade goods. But it wasn't until 1872 that a market was actually established for dried hides. Before that, it was all Indian tanned robes. So the whites got into it late, but they got into it with so much force that they definitely played a big part in finishing off the buffalo. It was a sad story in the history of America, really.
When I was growing up, I learned a lot by watching my dad.
It has always been illegal, and it was illegal in the 1840s to trade whiskey with the Indians. However, it was very common practice. Those reputable traders who could see what effect this was having did not like this, but they felt they had to fight fire with fire, so it was a very common practice, started at the rendezvous in the 1820s and 30s, and then continued in the 1840s and 50s. To always use whiskey whenever you trade and deal with the Indians. And they would usually insist on it. The Indians would usually insist on some of this. So what the trappers would do would be to water down and cut the whiskey as much as possible. They'd sometimes mix up hot peppers and tobacco juice and put in here with it. You wanted to give the Indians the cheapest whiskey possible. And the idea, of course, is to get them drunk and take advantage of them, which was not difficult to do. But in the long run, of course, this had a very bad effect on the Indians as well as on the trade in general. And there just wasn't much anybody could do about it, but it was a very common practice and unfortunately continued for many, many decades.
Battle Mountain is named for a famous Indian battle with 22 trappers, which included James Baker and Jim Bridger. The battle lasted 3 days, and due to superior firepower by the trappers, who were armed with hunting rifles, they defeated the Indians because of their strategic position in the rocks. This monument marks the spot where Thomas Edison camped in 1878 during a fishing trip. And while fishing on Battle Lake, he studied a fiber from his bamboo pole and later used it as the first filament for the incandescent light bulb. A few miles from Battle Mountain lies the town of Savory, Wyoming, population 25. And here in this tiny town, Jim Baker lived out the rest of his life operating this trading post. Men like Jim Baker and Pat O'Hara were the last of a dying breed who chose to live their life out in the solitude of the Rocky Mountains. Pat O'Hara was the last of the American Fur Company mountain men arriving in the Bighorn Basin in 1853. By 1878, when he saw the smoke of another man's campfire and heard his dog bark, he decided that the basin had become too populated, and he struck out for the mountains to live with the Crow Indians. Here in a rare 1913 photograph, Pat O'Hara is seen leaving for Oregon after the Bighorn Basin had become entirely too populated. He was never seen again. In the weeks to come, we will step back in time at Living History Farms, Des Moines, Iowa, and chat with the general storekeepers and the town doctor, and witness the evolution of farm life from pioneer times to the present. We will venture to the Old West, where the series will take you to abandoned gold mines and try our hand at panning for the elusive metal which drove so many to despair. We will visit the most significant military sites along the famous Oregon Trail for a glimpse of the everyday life of the people stationed there and the exploits of pioneers passing by on their way west. We will take you behind the bars of the frontier prisons to discover their role in the taming of the West and spend several enjoyable hours with our old friend Bill Cody for a personal glimpse of his world-famous grandfather, Colonel William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Other episodes include a look at frontier entertainment featuring a performance at the restored Atlas Theater in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a visit to the Wind River Reservation for a look at the blending of Native American culture and European religion at their Episcopal mission, and a talk with mountain men for an inside view of the Rocky Mountain fur trade and its influence on the exploration of the West. We thank you for allowing us to introduce our series, and we invite you to watch as we bring the living history of Americana on tour into the homes of America. Thanks for watching us, folks. The success of our program depends on you, the home viewer. If you have comments or questions about our program, please write me in care of Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729. We'll see you next week. That's Americana on Tour, Congerville, Illinois, 61729. Thanks for watching us, folks. Join us next week for another exciting episode of Americana on Tour.